Hey, how are you, Tim?
Doing fine, thank you. And you?
I'm doing great. I
Good.
think I mentioned to you I was going to go to the optometrist today, which I did. He dilated my eyes, which was a big mistake. but I'm here. I'm ready to go. I think
That's
I can
great.
see you. Yes, I can
Okay.
see you.
Well, that's all right. We're not talking about seeing. We're talking about exchanging information today. So your eyes will be secondary, but at the same point, we're going to have to talk about how the role of eyes have in communication too, and that's what we're going to talk about. One of the things that I really enjoyed exploring in the research of this was remembering all of the education I had in business and in communications itself. It was really wild. Business tells you communicate, communicate, communicate. And I actually had a communication skills professor in my undergraduate program that said it was like it is the glue that binds business together. And going into this discussion with you in project management, I wondered if this is something that you found as important as me. I didn't understand this really until I started teaching international projects. When you have 5 continents, 12 countries, 7 corporations, and they all use words differently, that's when you start really focusing on the importance of communication.
Absolutely. And I think, in my time and I don't want to just say as a project manager, but also as a delivery person on a project led
Mhm,
by great leaders and some who are great leaders, but not so communicative.
mhm.
I can honestly say that when we had open and often communication, the projects worked much smoother. But when we had situations where the project manager was a little bit of a recluse, liked to be in his office or her office a lot, liked to keep the door shut often, and didn't necessarily transparently communicate everything that we needed to know, the projects technically went well, but from I think you mentioned from a glue perspective, we did not gel as a team as much as we should
Right.
have.
Yeah, it's the engagement.
Yeah.
It's the engagement. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to, and I didn't have to be as a project manager, I didn't have to be everyone's best friend, nor as a delivery person on a project did I need the project manager to be my best friend. That was not the issue, but to be included in some of the decision making, not that I was a decision maker necessarily as a delivery person, but to be included in some of the decision processes, to understand what was happening, made my life a lot easier when it came to actually scoping out my tasks, looking at my end dates, looking at when I had to get things done. If I had a clear path to getting that done, it certainly saved a lot of time and a lot of do-overs in order to meet the schedule if I knew more of what was in the project manager's mind or his discussion with our clients. So yes, communication to me is absolutely critical on a project.
Let's step back here. You and I are in agreement. Let's start talking about different types of communication. Let's focus in first on written communication. Okay, so um, how important are writing skills, and how do they play in being a good project manager? Let's just start with simple question.
I Yeah, I think okay, so we're looking at writing skills per se at this point as a
Mhm.
part of communication. Yeah, I think well, number one, a project manager with really good writing skills understands his or her audience. And also, I think the writing skills are a sign of that person's, I don't want to say intelligence, that's not necessarily the right word, but certainly a sign of their ability to lead the project, to influence the project, to motivate people, the environment for the project to to be successful. And I think a lot of that comes from the tone, from the words chosen, from the way that the person presents themselves in writing. And I think, if a project manager, actually any delivery person, is haphazard in the writing, is careless in their writing style, I think it reflects poorly on them and as a result on the project itself. What are your thoughts?
You said two things that triggered something in my head. Number one, it's not necessarily the communication per se. Communication is the glue, I believe. Communication is the delivery of the information. So although it's the information that's critical, the delivery of the information is just as critical, and that's where we can fall apart. The second part of this whole writing thing, and you were talking about writing as clarification. And what I've discovered is when I really write something down, if I am going to write something down, that means I'm going to make it permanent. I'm creating a system of record. I'm creating a reference point I can go back to and say, what's changed here? Now, the reason I say this and the reason I don't jump right to clarification with you is two examples. Number one, a director sends you an email and says, see me. They wrote it really well. You know, it's permanent. It lasts forever and it achieves the purpose of being written, but it's not clear. Now, should I pack up my desk or should I be walking in waiting for a promotion? I don't know. And that's that's the intent. Writing is important for some purposes, but I think that we fall flat when we look at the formality. And when I deem formality, it doesn't mean everything's straight and organized. I mean, it actually is really clear to understand. And that's where you come off with what you were talking about, I believe.
I think you're right, because when someone says, please see me or see me, you can't, in writing, you can't understand any tonal inflection. If he's walking by your office or she's walking by your office and said, hey, come see me, then I know I'm in trouble, right? Versus,
yeah,
hey,
yeah, there's with
there's a
emails
tonal.
or there's a sticky note on your monitor. I used to have a director that was horrible with that. He just put a sticky note on the monitor saying see me, and there's no way to infer any other information beyond that. There was no way to actually convert that into usable information.
Yeah, now I have had project managers who have done that. And once you get used to it, typically what it comes down to is I dropped by your office and you weren't there, so come see me. And typically it was just as innocent as that. But you're right. It was very clear in terms of there's no misunderstanding of the fact that the person wants to see you. But at the same time, putting that doubt or that thought process in one's mind in terms of, uh-oh, am I in trouble? Or, oh, is this going to be good? Is not a good thing. So
Yeah.
I think taking care, even in a please see me memo, you might have said, hey, I just ran into the client manager in the hallway. She said A, B, C, D, E. What do you think? Come see me. Then I have some context, right?
There you go. There you go. That was the word I was looking for.
Context.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Exactly.
Because when it comes down to project managers, they probably should be the hub around which communication revolves.
It's funny. You look at the again. I trace everything back to PMI and the PMBOK. You look in the PMBOK, and the purpose of communication management is to ensure that communication is properly planned, done, and monitored. You don't control communication. You monitor and you adjust for change, which I found fascinating. So you don't do all the communication, you're exactly right, but you ensure that it makes it really easy for everybody to communicate and communicate the information that's necessary.
Well, and that's true, because when you plan your communication ahead of time, and then you make that plan known to the entire team, and by the way, to the client's team as well, because don't forget, the clients often have their own way of communicating in their organization, but projects are different. Projects are much more they've got a spear point, they've got a definite process that they need to attain to. And so as a result of that, all staff have to be on that same communication trail. And I think what you were talking about was planning that communication ahead of time makes sense. But then in terms of monitoring it, are we in fact following the rules that we established for ourselves? Do I have some flippant emails here? Then that's a no-no, because one of the things I always said in my communication plan is that we are always, always, always professional, precise, concise, and to the point with our clients and with our staff. So yes, communication plans are important.
Yep. And it gets so important when you have these external cultures that start blending inside your project. One of my friends who moved back to Egypt about 15 years ago was a peer with me back in consulting days, and he always started with a slide on his kickoff saying, "Here's our lexicon." And it seems silly for a 6-week project to do that until you realize that this is actually creating and establishing the culture. It's not just creating channels of communication. It's establishing how we treat and respect each other, and we treat and respect the work. And again, when you get back to one of your initial statements we were talking about, this establishes the tone of not just the project manager leading the work, but the work itself.
Mm-hmm. I can still remember, and I wish I had retained some of these emails that I captured as a result of my many years in the project manager chair. But I still remember, even amongst the clients, some wicked emails going back and forth with me being copied on them, and the discomfort that created for me as sort of an unexpected go-between in certain situations. The rancor that was established, now out of consideration for my client, and obviously out of the agreements that I assigned that we would keep things confidential even after the project was over, I did not retain those emails. But it's one of those things where a bad communication, a bad email, a bad text message, whatever it is, can just create such havoc that months of creating an environment of process can be ruined with 1 or 2 emails. So I think exactly.
Yeah, and that's the role of a project manager, because you have a dilemma. What is appropriate for the culture of one environment may not be appropriate for the culture of another environment. And it's something as simple as sharing information. But in a project, like you said, it's a point that's saying, we have to figure out a way to do this, and we have to figure out quickly and do it so you don't step on each other's toes and work well. And so a project manager's job is never done in clarifying communication.
No, and and think about this: a project manager who has developed that experience and understands what it takes to lead. Do you feel, at least I do, but do you feel that there's some nuance required in a project manager in the way he communicates,
Oh,
depending
yes.
on his audience or her audience?
Oh, yes. For instance, now I'm going into operations, but it's the same thing, right? I had a director who always looked at me and said, "Tim, I know you're smart, but I just don't understand you." It's like, thank you. At the same time, I've had other directors or managers said, that's an interesting question. How about if we take that question and turn it around and look at it that way? Number one, they're not making me wrong. Number two, they're able to intuitively understand that even though my question is not the right question, it's going in the right direction. And they were able to mentor me just by listening and understanding that communication. That was such a powerful lesson to observe them to do that. I use it in my classes all the time. I say, you know what? I used to say no, right? That's incorrect. But I said, you know what? Let's look at that question. How about you and I just turn that question around? Is that a better question? Is that really getting to the point you're wondering about? And 8 times out of 10, it is. And I don't know how I do this. One of my directors was like this with active listening too. Active listening is easy to understand, but it's such a powerful tool in communication, whether it's writing or whether it's oral. The ability to take in, and like you said, context, not just take in the message, but the context, so you have a greater understanding to not just what they're asking for, but what they need.
Absolutely. And I know one of the things that really helped me um, as a project manager, or even as a member of a PMO representing a client organization as their front people working with the IT provider, one of the things that I absolutely did right from day one was I studied every single person that I worked with directly. In a meeting, I studied them, whether they were paying attention or how they spoke. I studied the way they responded to written communication, and I took notes. And one of the things that I
Wow.
learned was that some people, now I'm going to talk about my client organization. Some people in the client organization wanted things spelled out for them very directly, concisely, but very directly. Some people wanted just a very quick summary. Some people wanted, somewhere in between. So as I studied people, I then changed my communication style to match what they were expecting. Now, when I dealt with my management, I would change that up again, because my management I'd known over the years. So sometimes my management wanted to see something in writing. Sometimes they preferred I quickly pick up the phone and alert them to something. But the main thing was, is I studied the people that I had to deal with, so I knew how to communicate with them. And I think that has held me in good stead throughout my career.
Oh, I bet it has. I bet it has. Yeah, that's so key. And man, the collecting of that data and the analysis of it must have taught you so much, not just about, communication needs, but human behavior itself.
Well, it got to the point, and this is kind of a little off the topic of communication, but not really. It got to the point where I even watched how they took their coffee. And so when I would show up at their office for an impromptu meeting, I would bring their coffee to them with the exact amount of sugar or cream that I had watched them put in. And they were
Yeah.
always shocked that I knew how they took their coffee. They were very happy to see me and then have that communication.
Wow, what
But
a
it's just,
statement. What a statement. What a statement that is to make to your clients and your stakeholders. It's like, I see you and I see the minor things. And that actually, number one, for me, that would be a little bit jarring. But on the other hand, it also tells me how you treat the work that I'm giving you. It's a
well,
power.
it's, yeah, and I think it's just a matter of respect. And I think the same thing. I don't know, what do you think in terms of how you communicate with your team? Because that tends to be less formal. But what are your thoughts about communicating with your team, or even the client team, in a less formal manner?
Formal means they tend to understand me. Um, I mean, informal means they understand my nuances. Okay. Formal means that I spend extra time ensuring they understand me. I have had a problem over the years slipping into an informal mode because I prefer to have people open and conversational. I like a collaborative environment. So when I go into informal mode, it fits that. But the problem is, when I'm informal in my communications, number one, my human nature slips in. And number two, um, um, I'm not as clear as I want. And so I like to be collaborative, but I found as I got older, about the age of 38 to 40, I started pulling back and said, This informal way of communicating with my team, number one, is not getting the results I want. Number two is not really meeting the objective of what I want from working with people. I'm not giving them respect. When you're informal and relaxed, you're doing things the way you prefer. And when you're formal, you're respectful of others. And that's why my ears perked up when you said respect.
Yeah, and I think if I can add to what you just said, I think you're exactly correct. There's a formality, but when I communicate with my team, and we're still talking about writing, when I communicate in writing, I tend to be more conversational, which people could mistake as informal, but in that conversational tone, it's a very different tone. It's not one of demand, it's one of collaboration. And I think you had mentioned collaboration earlier as well. But one of the things that I can't get used to, and this is maybe me being an old codger, excuse me, but this idea of let's go even one step more casual, and that is through texting or instant messaging, where people deliberately misspell or shorten words. The word ARE is spelled R. The word FOUR is spelled for. Maybe I'm old, I don't know, but I just can't get used to that. And even in my text messages, I make sure that my words are spelled correctly. I don't know what you feel about that.
I understand language because I study so many other languages, both archaic and current. I see language as very fluid. But again, when I see people who use the language as it's academically presented, they're giving the language a sense of respect. They're treating it with the respect that they do. And it's being lazy, but we all know that laziness is what drives the change in communication. And laziness is what drives everything in culture. We have to expect it's part of nature. But I agree with you. I'm not an emoji guy. I'm a word guy. I'm a crafter of communication and sharing information like you. I think it's the nature of project manager that drove us to this, to be, cracking the whip over the grammar and the spelling and the structure. And we've done that so many decades. It's like everything else is unnatural. I have another story about texting that really highlights one part of communication too, by the way.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I want to hear it.
So we all think communications is sharing information two ways, right? Unintended and intended. This is the thing that I really am fascinated by. And like you, picking up the coffee and knowing exactly what people are thinking and acting before they realize that you understand. I worked in data security for 3.5 years. I did a lot of research for my corporation in analyzing the impact of lost data and data breaches and that kind of thing. It's really interesting to see how people communicate and share information, but they don't realize how much they're really sharing. Again, we can think about body language, even on the internet here with us. You can tell me when I'm distracted. You can tell when things are moving. These are things that we key in on as humans, but there are other things that we give away that are unintended. For instance, one of my friends was a researcher in healthcare and healthcare data breaches. And he said that one of the greatest tricks that a healthcare attorney had was, if you wanted to ruin healthcare's case in a court, you get the doctor up on the bench and you ask them about how they share information.
Hmm.
because, yeah, inadvertently, doctors generally send patient information SMS.
Oh, wow. HIPAA, HIPAA.
Exactly. And SMS has it has no encryption. And so the attorney, all the attorney does, it's a mic drop whenever this happens. And this has been known for years. And this is so ingrained in the culture. And this is something that we have to understand too. What are we not communicating is sometimes important, but what we are communicating we don't know is almost more important.
Oh, absolutely. If I can take that even one step further, I don't know how many meetings I have been in, formal meetings, perhaps status meetings, whatever, with the client, with maybe some of the big wigs there. And one of my staff may be presenting and their PowerPoint is up, and in comes an instant message because they forgot to turn that off on their screen. And as they're presenting some incredible piece of wisdom, along comes, hey, got time for lunch?
You know, Murphy plans those events.
Well,
It's there to keep us humble, man. And it's so funny. And through remote communications in Zoom meetings, even having a phone go off or a bell, it makes us cringe.
yeah.
But you know what? That's what our job is. Our job is to cringe when the focus is distracted, when the communication is interrupted.
Well, and in those situations, got time for lunch wasn't so bad. There were other communications that were not meeting worthy, shall we say. And, and of course, we had to then crack down with our staff to make sure that as they were presenting, everything was turned off, no instant messages could get through, no other interruptions, as you were saying. The other thing we did, and this also goes to written communication, is we ensured that people who were on Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat and Facebook and all these other things, was that we did not say they couldn't use those while on the project site, or because obviously that's part of their personal life. What we did ask them to do, though, was to never, ever, ever speak about the project in any way, shape, or form, because that was something that we needed. We couldn't monitor. That was something we needed to control.
It,
Because, go ahead.
yeah, exactly. And the way we solved it was put together a formal class and said, this is social communication. This is professional communication. These are the rules and these are the boundaries. And creating that part that gets established, part of the ground rules and the charter. It we have these old project managers who stick, ground rule, ground rule. After you've done projects for a while, it's like, I know why he's doing this, because he's experienced all these things.
Yeah.
And it is critical. And it's going to become even more critical here because we're understanding nuances of remote working. And I assume that there's going to have to be a lot more give and take from both sides of the communication interchange to ensure that, number one, communications are not dropped, and number two, communications are monitored and the changes are adjusted.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you something here. I know we're getting about halfway through. One of the things that I've really struggled with my students is, how do you make sure, and let's keep it easy right now. How do you make sure written communications are acknowledged? And let's first talk about acknowledgement. Um, how do you approach acknowledgement of information exchange just between you and other people on the project?
Well, typically on the project, there was an expectation. There was almost an unwritten rule. We talked about culture last week, so an unwritten rule that if a person sent an email, whether it was the project manager to staff or staff to staff or staff to project manager, there was an expectation that that communication was answered or acknowledged. And we did not allow, in the projects I worked on, we did not allow communication to go more than 1 or 2 days. And depending on the urgency, within some of the email processes, you can set an urgency. And if the urgency was set such that you needed an immediate response, we made sure that that happened. So that was kind of an unwritten rule. But the second thing, the main thing that I did, and this also goes in terms of how I made sure that I was being understood. Was whenever I wrote an email, and it could have been the most casual email to my staff or a very formal, precise, almost contractual email to my client, I would read that email several times. Sometimes I would change a word, sometimes I would change, and you say, well, it takes time. I'll tell you what, it does take time, but it takes a lot more time to unravel unwitting communication than to get it right in the first place. and then the other thing that I would do is very carefully check the to list and the CC list, and make sure that in some cases, in certain clients, you even had to have the order of people correct in that list. And so all of those were checked, double checked, and triple checked. And in those situations within the project, the communication from that perspective, I thought always went very well. Very seldom did I have a misunderstanding situation because I did my homework and did my due diligence up front. How about yourself?
Boy, the same. So yes. Let's take written communication. You're right. I approached it from a contractual standpoint, and a lot of my communications were going off across as many as 20 to 25 major corporations, and it was like, no, I can't have anybody miscommunicate. And I was working with multiple geographies and governments and education fortresses and all these things. And it was like, no, you're not going to get this right. It wasn't like, what if I get these things wrong? It was like, no, this is something I'm not going to touch. This is something that I'm going to do absolutely right. So the time invested up front allowed me to actually deflect those issues that you have coming up, because a miscommunication is a disaster, and it's easy to fix. It's a 3-minute fix before you get into the problem.
Yeah. And the other thing is check that to-do list every once in a while. And here's the worst part. And I know we want to get onto oral as well, but one more thing. One of the other things I do is I read all the way to the bottom. It's amazing how many times I've had emails sent to me when they really should have removed the bottom part of that email before it got sent to me, but they did not. And I always read to the bottom and get rid of things that are inappropriate for the audience that my email is intended. So just one extra sort of trick or understanding of the trade, because communication is important and we need to be sure that that communication lands correctly.
And it's doubly important in our world now. Technology. I use Microsoft Outlook, right? It's one of the major products. And a few years ago, they incorporated these threaded email strings, and that gets even more devious, because you cannot interpret what's part of this email versus the entire email thread. And this takes not just analysis, but sometimes I just start an entirely new email to say, okay, let's have a different conversation here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to me. And in oral, when you and I are speaking now we're being recorded. But if we weren't being recorded, someone could say, well, Tim said this. Well, they might have got the flavor, but not the exact wording. But an email, you cannot argue what Tim said, because it's out there and it may have gotten forwarded and forwarded and forwarded again. So
it's forever.
Yes,
it's not just permanent. It's permanent, forever permanent.
So do you think that oral skills are as important as written skills for project managers?
Certainly. You have one shot at getting communication orally correct. And you do it appropriately. It's again, it's my respect for the language, but it's also respect for the people listening. And then it's pragmatic. It's like, I don't want to go through the same conversation 3 more times. Let's get it right the first time.
Yeah.
And I am going to poke and prod and ensure that that person, number one, knows what I'm saying and understands it like I do. And number two, is able to act on that and knows how to use that information without further asking. Those are the two hindrances I've found in the way I've miscommunicated. Number one, the reception and the interpretation. And then number two, the ability to act on that information. And I found out that if I attend to both of those in my conversations, even if it's just over a cup of coffee, it solves most of the problems for me.
Well, and the other thing, and there's so many project managers are, and I've been guilty of this as well, is why have a meeting when an email will suffice? Or why, if you're going to have a status meeting because it's contractual, because it's part of the culture of the project, whatever. True, you do have the written status because you need that ongoing documentation for the project as to how you got here. But when you come into a status meeting, project managers, please do not just regurgitate what everyone can read, or do not move what's on the paper onto a PowerPoint slide so that everyone can read it on PowerPoint. And what I found the best thing to do in the oral transcription of a formal status report, I found is that to add some color, and to add some conversation, and to add some question periods, because there are things in status reports that require questioning by your team, by your client, whoever. And I'm using status reporting now as one example. But you get into situations where something is put on paper and it becomes permanent documentation. It deserves questioning or further investigation, perhaps in a face-to-face meeting. And so there are times when oral presentation, oral exactness, oral preciseness are important in going over things that even are already in writing. But it doesn't mean that everything that is in that you need a meeting for everything that you could absolutely have put into writing. So
You're right. You're right. The first rule of any action or decision you make in projects is it necessary? Does it move the project forward in a good direction, or does it limit its potential for failure? Every decision should be able to get through that matrix, okay? That every action, every meeting, everything a project manager does, they should be weighing that. Does it make the project better or less? No opinion, just that, and it's going to make things easier and more pragmatic. Second thing, why is that meeting needed? Maybe the vice president said we're going to have a meeting, and that's why. And then you're right, the meeting is structured around those specific needs. Or there is a decision we have to make, and we have to sit and we have to gather more information, and then we're going to make the decision. And that's the meeting. And if that decision takes 10 minutes, great. If that decision takes 2 hours, great. We made that decision. The decision is more important than the structure of the meeting. The meeting is just a tool to make that decision occur.
and don't you find that an oral precision in the way you present your ideas, present your thoughts, can influence for the good or for the not so good? And I think that's a skill that project managers need to understand is, and I hate the word nuance, but it's a good word in this situation.
Oh no, it's brilliant. It's spot on. So there are 3 things. And again, a project manager has to either persuade, convince, or somehow get in other people to think the way they are. And there are 3 things that have to be in place for a project manager to do that. Number 1, it has to be researched. You have to know, you have to know what you're talking about. Number one. Number two, complex. No, it has to be simple. It has to be simple. You know, every time you add a connection point, and this is Peter Drucker, every time you add a connection point, you add an opportunity for failure, risk. You know, it's a geometric progression on the number of connections in a circuit. Okay. Number three, conviction. If you don't believe something, you're not the person that's going to deliver that. Those three things. It's the doing of the homework, it's the simplicity of the solution, and it's the conviction. And that's what I believe, what I call nuance. It's the context.
Yeah, I just didn't want the word, because nuance is often used with politicians, and I don't want to ever present a project manager as a politician, because that's give the wrong connotation. You need to be politically astute, but to be a glad-hander, silver-tongued politician is not my idea of a project manager.
Yeah, we're not wordsmiths for the purpose of removing doubt from us to other positions. We're not there to please everybody. We're there for a purpose. And if you ask me the color of the house, I'll tell you from where I'm standing here at the front of the house is white, and give me a chance to walk around the house and I'll tell you the color of the other sides. Yeah. That's the purpose of a project manager.
Exactly. I do remember though, I remember on one project, the CIO of an organization that we were working with challenged me. Not fortunately, he didn't do this publicly because it would have embarrassed him more than myself, but challenged me after a meeting in terms of some of the statements I had made. And I looked at him and I said, I do not open my mouth in a meeting unless what I am about to say has been researched thoroughly and I have my facts straight. If you see me being quiet on a subject that I should be speaking about, it's because I haven't yet researched it. But rest assured, whatever you heard in that meeting, I can point to you chapter and verse of where it is that is happening, and where it's, where it's part of what it is that we have to deal with. And so you need to understand that I will never, ever, ever polish the truth for your sake. I will give you the full, unpolished, unvarnished truth at all times.
You may not like me, but you'll know what you're going to get from me.
Exactly.
Yeah. Boy, this actually opens up a whole set of conversations. This is the difficult part of communications. It exposes the whole role of project management and the purpose of project management outside of, the politics and the culture. It is basically the way corporations change. And we have to appreciate that these changes are changes to human beings and relationships. And so this is why I go back to that whole concept of respect. And walking into any meeting like that, you wonder why project managers have confidence. And you wonder why all project managers have a lot of confidence, because they learn these rules that you're talking about. Do your homework, have your facts, state on things that you can repeat chapter and verse. And this is what allows us to hold our heads high. It's not the fact that we've, been in, a bazillion fights. It's that we walk into a meeting and we say, okay, I'm ready. Let's talk.
Oh, absolutely. And the ability to read the room when you walk into that as well. There are times when there's times when I come in, I go, I get this funny story. I'm going to start the meeting off. And you look in and you think, oh, something's happened here. I better not start with that funny story.
This is not funny story day.
This is not funny story day. So just the whole idea of being able to read the room and to get the to get the, and I'll use that word again, nuance correct as you begin to answer questions or as you begin to offer information.
Right. And this is a struggle with new project managers. How much information is enough information? And if the project manager is not telling me, one of the most common questions I get in my classes is, oh, that's a stakeholder register. Okay, do I allow everybody to see the stakeholder register? Or do I keep it private? Or what do I do with that? And this is where I had to learn to actually be able to create these structures and tools, like the word necessary. I created the definition of necessary just to get this sense of how you make these type of decisions in communication to new and emerging project managers. This is tough. We all understand what confidential information means and top secret, but you know, when we get into sharing information inside the project, do I share this or not? It's sort of hard, number one, for new project managers to ask that question. And number two, when you sit down and think of it, that really is hard. How do I decide to share certain information and not? What I know this is going way off track, Merv, but what's your take on that?
Wow. So I guess it depends again on my audience. You know, if there's a conflict at the senior levels, let's say between my manager and client management, do I take that to my status meeting with my staff and say, oh, there's this there's this unfortunate conversation going on between the two and maybe the project's in jeopardy? No, I'm not going to do that, because first of all, I'll let them work it out, the senior people work it out. I want my project team to work on what they need to know, and not end up in a gossip situation, which these things happen to be. But if my senior manager, on the other hand, says, you know, we're having this conflict at the highest levels, here's what I want you to tell the team, this is how far you can go, then definitely I will share that with the team. But I think what you're saying is right. What's necessary, who has the need to know and the right to know. And it's not a matter of, I'm a very transparent person. It's not a matter of keeping information, because if I have the information, then then I'm the smartest guy in the block. No, if I have information, I'm going to spread it around if it helps you. I'm going to contain it if it hinders you. I think that's kind of one of my rules.
Mhm.
Need to know, right to know.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically they have a purpose and a function on the project, and the information I hold or I share is going to help them. And that's the approach that a project manager really needs to take. Otherwise, you're damaging your project and you're damaging your purpose.
Yeah. The other thing I found, and this goes a little bit off what we're talking about too, but the other thing I found, another rule that I follow, maybe a trick of the trade, I don't know. But in consulting, I don't know if I heard this or if I made this up, but I call it the 7 times rule. They won't hear you until they've heard it 7 times. So there are times when you need to bring a particular important piece of information in different ways. And about the 7th time, people go, ah, now I know what he means. Yes. And that will go along with that.
You
So,
know, it's funny. I heard a great lecture on how people learn a few months ago, and he said when people tell you, "I remember," they don't remember. They recognize. They saw it. They saw it. They did not interpret it. They saw it. And so your 7 times rule is actually you creating an iterative interaction with them so that they can see it enough times that they comprehend. So much of our work is not skills that you memorize. It's not definitions that you memorize. It's character and attributes, and it's muscle memory. And you don't do that through one cycle. You don't learn that way, and you don't you know you don't integrate that knowledge that way. And that's a wonderful trick.
It is. And the other part about oral communication that we've been talking about too, is the part that I like about oral, even on Zoom or even on some of the interactive remote ways, is that you can see people's facial gestures. You can hear their tone of voice. You can see their hand gestures, perhaps. You can see how they cock their head or whatever it is. And I think with oral presentations, because of the ability to read people as well as it becomes a better vehicle for making your message understandable. It becomes a better vehicle for also asking for acknowledgement of your message. And it's also a way that you can learn to be precise just in the way that you also present your body language along with your vocal variety.
Very good. It's being that integrated communicator. It's having that alignment. When we have the body and the mouth saying two different things, there's that dissonance that we can't just put our finger to, but there's something wrong. And that's what cops use when they're asking people questions. Is the body sort of off from the words? And again, human beings are naturally predisposed for this. With a little bit of practice, you can refine this really easily.
And you can learn to read it really easily. Although sometimes, and I'll tell you this, I have a friend who was giving a major presentation, and part of oral, part of oral communication is sometimes you're in a sit-down meeting with 4 people, sometimes you're presenting to 500 off of a stage. So whatever you are as a project manager, but he was giving a presentation one time, and the people were enjoying his chuckles. They were taking notes on his information. But he kept zeroing in on a man, and he said it was like the 4th row dead center, who sat there with his arms crossed and a frown on his face. And this kept throwing him off. He felt that he was off on his presenting style. He felt he was not communicating well. And the presentation was finished. He left. People came up to him and said, that was great information, but he could not get this man out of his mind, and it kept throwing him off, and it bothered him. And later on that afternoon, that same gentleman approached him in a hallway, and he said, oh, here it comes. I wonder what I did wrong. And the guy goes, that was the best presentation I have ever seen in my entire career. And his name was Darren. He goes, what do you mean? What are you talking about? I actually saw you, and you had your hands folded and you had a scowl on your face. And he said, oh, that's my resting face. People say I have an angry resting face, and I was cold. So we have to be careful of those verbal or the nonverbals as well.
Yeah, there's one last topic I want to talk about with you before we close. It's acknowledgement. This is one of the things that I have struggles with, and I continue to struggle with, is how do I make sure that people really do understand what I'm saying? I know we can ask them, but is that enough?
Boy, I tell you, I'm glad you asked this question, because this is something I learned on when I was part of one of the big 4, actually. One of the things that they taught all of their up and coming consultants as they kind of progressed in their careers was to receive this acknowledgement. And what they would do is, after the meeting or after a major couple of points were made, they would stop and they would summarize back to the client or back to their team in terms of what had just transpired, and basically say, this is what I heard, without saying this is what I heard. They would say in summary format exactly what had been talked about, and someone else was writing it down. And if there was a mistake in their repetition of what had happened, it would be corrected. Then they knew that they were acknowledged. If there was no challenge to what they did in the summary, they knew that they had been heard. If there was a challenge, they knew they got something wrong, and they would correct that right then and there. So I think that ability to repeat back in summary format to what had just transpired, I think is a very effective tool to making sure that you have been heard and acknowledge that you've been understood.
That's the 7 repetitions basically that
Almost.
you're doing. Yeah, yeah. That's I have that same thing, and I've been challenged by Tim. I told you that. I'm sorry. I have a lot in my head. No, I want to make sure that you understand this. It's
Well,
sort of important.
and
And
just a couple of key phrases like, if I understood you correctly, this is what we're about to do.
right,
Or
right,
did I hear you correctly that this is what you said? And it doesn't take a lot to, to make that acknowledgement come back to you.
right. And the same goes for written. It's like, I see that you voted this way, and now you're saying this. Now, that could be a challenging situation where you confront them and they could close down. But with a client, you can say, instead of that, I see something's happened here. What's changed?
That's right. Exactly.
It's
Without,
without giving them an out,
yeah.
giving them an opportunity to not defend themselves, but to actually give you that context you need to understand. And being open that way, you're not in you're not placing a bias into your perception of what's really going on. It's
Well,
leaving it open.
and I had a situation very similar to that. And what had happened was the client had responded to me, and in typing out their memo or their email back to me had missed the word not, N-O-T. And so obviously it came across. And so when I came back and said, I'm misunderstanding, help me out here, I'm misunderstanding something. And they came back and said, oh, my fault. I meant not this as opposed to this. So
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Sometimes you need to be able to challenge without challenging.
Right. And to create that environment where people feel that they're not being challenged, and to actually have people understand this is part of our culture. This is the expectation. We're not, people are not wrong. And I start the ethics portion of my class like this. People are not wrong or right. That's not the purpose of people. People are the source of the solutions. And creating that as part of the integral component of what we call culture creates a sense of safety and openness where we can get more information instead of have people locked down and be defensive.
Well, and exactly. And, I think we probably, as we wrap up, I think a lot of what you just said now and some of the other stuff, I think if you look at the PMBOK, if you look at sort of its guidance to us as project managers in terms of, I think they call it the 5 C's. I think we've
Mm-hmm.
talked very much about consistency and clarity and content even, and certainly through communication, having that connection. One thing we didn't really touch on, and we're probably almost out of time, is creativity. And I think some of that comes across also in who you are as a person. I know for myself, I love to tell a story when I start off a meeting, but it has to be a story that deals with it can't just be a story. It has to fit the context. Sometimes in an email, I'll allude to something that happened before, or I'll put in a little nonsensical rhyme or something once I understand my audience, but just something that creates a little creativity, a little interest so that people will read or will respond to what you're saying. But
That's very common. Actually, research talks about groups who want to make a great influence on society do this. It shakes society up a little bit, and it gets society to be a little curious and see what's going on. That's a very smart trick there.
Well, I was thinking that even in our conversations on these podcasts, I don't think you and I can ever explain a point unless we have a story. And
Oh,
being and being as old as we are, we have a million of them.
and since we don't have a fire to cook hot dogs over and tell those stories, this is a good vehicle for us to actually do that. And
It is.
this is indeed a treat. We've had fun with this. Is this another topic we can go on, or is there or are you pretty comfortable with this?
Well, I'll tell you, I think our hour is probably up. Let's take this off. I think I've got some ideas where we can even continue this conversation at another time. But
That would be great, because
yeah,
I think it's worthy of further exploration. Thanks again, Merv. It's always a treat to
it is.
be talking with you and exploring these topics. I really appreciate the audience out there too. You guys are doing the good things by exploring and learning.
Absolutely. And you're still on LinkedIn, Tim. You can be obviously you're still on LinkedIn, as am I. So
Yeah, and where else can we find you?
I've also got a website, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com. And you'll find my services there, and you'll also find a labor of love, my blog, where I've paralleled 52 weeks of the PMBOK from a people
Oh, that's
perspective.
brilliant.
Yeah. So,
That's brilliant. Thanks again, Merv. It's always a treat.
all right. Until next time, we'll see you same place, same channel. What do they say? Same, yeah, same place, same channel, same time.
Sounds great. Thanks again.